مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الفضيحة الصغيرة الحالية في واشنطن تخص نظام بريد إلكتروني سري استخدمته هيلاري كلينتون خلال عملها كوزيرة للخارجية. ولكن الصحفيين يخوضون معركة كل يوم مع المتحدث باسم الوزير للتعرف على التفاصيل السياسية الخارجية الأميركية. مين ندعم؟ مين نعارض؟ إلى مين نتحدث؟ مين لا تبكي بمعزل؟ وماذا نفعل للدفع مصالحنا؟ الحكومات في كل أنحاء العالم تريد السيطرة على هذه المعلومات، والصحفيون يريدون تحرير المعلومات وإتاحتها للجميع. قد تختلف القواعد فيما بين النظم الديمقراطية والنظم الدكتاتورية، ولكن المنافسة كثيرا ما تكون واحدة. ضيفنا هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن واحد من أشرس المنافسين في هذه المعركة، وهو ماثيو لي، مراسل الشؤون الدبلوماسية لأسوسييتد بريس، واحدة من كبريات وكالات الأنباء الدولية. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here with Matt Lee, the diplomatic reporter at the State Department for the Associated Press. Matt, thank you very much for being with us
Thanks
today.
for having me.
So you are celebrated for being a tormentor of State Department spokespeople. For our viewing audience, first describe the scene.
Well, the briefing room is an interesting place. It's set up like a television set almost, with the podium in the front and the television monitors on the sides, which display a map of the world. The front row of reporters is generally the wire service reporters, of which I am one, and then it goes back television, newspapers. It's an experience that not a lot of people have, being in this room, and I think it would be it's often very cold in there. The lights that are shining on the person who is at the podium are quite hot, so they tend to jack up or ramp up the air conditioning quite a bit, so it's often cold. In terms of the interactions that we have, the reporters and the spokesperson of whoever that happens to be on the podium, generally they're respectful and intended to draw out details, elements of the administration's foreign policy. Oftentimes the answers that we get are not particularly revelatory, or often they don't actually answer the question that has been asked. And that's, I think, where you see some of the tension, if you want to call it tension, come into play, when reporters don't get an answer to a question that they either, one, haven't asked in the first place, or the answer does not. You ask a question that requires a simple yes or no answer, and you get 3 or 4 minutes of spin. It can be a little bit frustrating.
So just again, how many of you are there? How many journalists?
There's generally I would say between 15 and 30, depending on what the issue of the day is. If there's something really big going on, then there'll be a lot more.
And this is every day. There's a State Department.
There is every
briefing?
day. The State Department, the State Department is, I think, fairly unique in being a foreign ministry that has an on-camera televised briefing pretty much every workday of the week. Now, sometimes if the Secretary of State happens to be testifying on Capitol Hill, there won't be a briefing because everyone is, of course, watching.
And from your perspective, and everyone on your side of the podium, how do you view the spokesperson? Is it their job, in your perspective, to provide information, to control information, to hide information? How do you see it?
I think that their job, the way I see their job, and they would whoever it is would probably have a different a different explanation of this, but I see their job as fundamentally explaining what the administration's policy is and how that policy is being implemented. There are several audiences that they have to talk to. One is the American public, to explain to them what their government is doing, at least as in terms of foreign policy, but also then the international audience, to explain to foreign governments what exactly the administration has done, is doing. In doing that, however, there is an element of, there can be an element of obfuscation is the word I'm trying to say here. We would like it for them to, we would like for them to explain in detail and clearly what exactly the administration is doing, what its goals are, and how it is going about trying to reach those goals. Many times, however, the administrations, and this is of both political parties, not just Democrats that are in power now, not Republicans that were in before, they don't want to tell you exactly what it is that's going on. And so there can be an element, I think, of trying to hide or at least not fully explain. Sins of omission rather than commission, I think, is the way you might describe it.
And so for you, covering this, what's a good day? Is a good day relating the message that the spokesman is trying to give, or is a good day getting a scoop?
Getting a scoop is always a good day. There are very few scoops that come out of State Department or any other briefing in this town, as you well know. I mean, what is the most important and newsworthy information of the day doesn't come from a spokesperson at all, but from a senior official who is not on camera and who is often not named at all. So I would say for me, a good day is if I can get my questions answered to my satisfaction, and then be able to write a compelling, one would hope, news story about whatever that issue is. Oftentimes, there's more than one issue. There's many, there's many different topics come up during the course of a State Department briefing. But a good day is getting answers. It's always nice to get a scoop. It's always that's what we journalists we live for that. But like I said, during the briefings, you're rarely gonna have a major announcement. Certainly not a scoop. A policy change. If you can get the administration to say, or if they decide to announce that policy X that has been in place for the last 50 years is being changed. But the thing is that those announcements usually leak out, and I'm thinking particularly in reference to the Cuba, the normalization of relations with Cuba that the administration announced earlier this year.
So do you ever say to yourself, you know what, this is too big to break? This will hurt our national interest, this will hurt our foreign policy?
There are times, not so much on the State Department beat, but I know my colleagues who cover intelligence, the intelligence world, the Pentagon, there are times when information could be damaging, could be life-threatening, and we're always willing to listen to arguments from the administration, whichever administration that is, on why a story shouldn't be published or should be held off on for some time. Now, we don't always agree with that, but there are certain cases where I think it has happened, and there are well-known cases where that has happened as well, and not just with the Associated Press, but with other major organizations, the New York Times, Washington Post. But I think generally the job of the journalist and the job of the press, at least it should be everywhere, I think, but in the United States, is to not to err on the side of the administration, but rather to err on the side of what's in the public interest. And a lot of times, the public's right to know, I think, outweighs the government's desire for for secrecy. And
Okay.
it's a very case-by-case basis.
Okay, we'll come back in a moment with Matt Lee to talk about covering the Department of State. Our guest again is Matt Lee. Matt is the diplomatic writer for the Associated Press, covering the State Department and American foreign policy. He has traveled with every Secretary of State since Madeleine Albright, reporting from more than 100 countries. Matt joined AP in 2007 after a dozen years with the French news agency Agence France-Presse, where he covered the State Department. He served as the Kenya-based Deputy Bureau Chief for East Africa, and he headed the bureau in Cambodia. He graduated from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service in 1989, and he began his journalism career at the Washington Post and the Daily Progress in Charlottesville, Virginia. So Matt, sometimes there is jousting between you and the spokesperson. What's the goal here? Trying to get the spokesperson to say something he or she doesn't want to say?
Well, I'm not sure if it's trying to get them to say something that they don't want to say, but trying to, if you get an answer to a question that is vague, that is wrong, or that just is not responsive, I think that it's the job of the reporter to try to draw that out, to try to get to the heart of what the answer really is. And I think that, as we were talking about before, that when a response is incomplete, it leaves something very critical to the equation out. Then I think that the answer is kind of a non-answer, and it needs to be followed up on. So when I get into backs and forths with the spokesperson, whoever that might be, and I have been doing this a long time, since 1999 at the State Department. So this cuts across administrations of both types. What I'm trying to do is to get them to really be serious and straightforward and honest about what the policy is. So, for example, if country X suddenly announces something that the U.S. administration is in favor of, and the question is, well, what do you think of this? And they say, well, we welcome this development. This is very good. Well, is there a reason behind why this country did what it did? Did the United States suddenly decide to give them some extra assistance? Did they decide to vote in favor of them at the United Nations or something like that? Did they decide to not support one of that other country's rivals in something? And that is all, I think, relevant and forms what is critical background to understanding why it is governments do what they do. And I think this cuts across the whole of government, domestic and foreign policy, but my area is foreign policy, and so it covers the world.
So have spokespersons ever gotten so angry at you that they retaliate, they ignore, or they do other things that make it difficult for you to do your job?
Not that I'm aware of. I will say that the tension or the combativeness that you might see in the briefings is not something that goes beyond. I'm not enemies with any of the spokespeople that I have these battles with. In fact, we can be quite friendly. They understand, and I understand. This is a professional thing. They're up there not as themselves, not as themselves as an individual. They're up there representing the government, and in particular the Department of State. So if I'm going at them because I'm not getting an answer that I think that I should get, it's not a personal thing. It is journalist, reporter versus bureaucracy, administration, and the administration. So it's not. It never gets to the point where it's personal, where there's where there's anger off outside of the briefing room.
So how would you rate or compare the Obama administration in terms of openness compared to the other administrations that you've covered in their foreign policy?
About average. It's certainly, I don't think, the president came in saying he was going to have the most transparent administration in the history of the United States. I don't think that is true.
Who stood out for being open in your experience?
Well, there were, that's a very difficult question. No government wants to be fully transparent. As we were talking about before, secret negotiations, if they are not secret, often don't work. As several secretaries of state are fond of saying, mushrooms grow best in the dark. So it's a bit unfair to say that this administration is worse or better than any previous one, because they all have an interest in keeping secrets secret. So I don't know if I can give a grade or say that one administration was more transparent than another, because we don't know what we don't know. It could turn out that there were, as when the historical documents become available, a lot of stuff going on during, say, the second Clinton administration, when I started covering the State Department, that we simply didn't know about and won't know about until the historical record becomes clear and is released. So I hesitate to say that there was one shining example of openness and transparency in any of the administrations that I'd covered, because frankly, you can't know until the whole history of the foreign relations of the United States is published.
When you think back on these years that you've been covering all these big stories, what's one that got away, that you said to yourself in hindsight, I should have had that story?
Well, I think that not just me, but I think collectively, with very, very few exceptions, the biggest story that got away from everyone was in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, and the intelligence or lack of intelligence, the intelligence failures that preceded it. And I think that there are a lot of people in Washington and elsewhere who regret that there wasn't more skepticism, there wasn't more pushing to really get to the bottom of what was going on and the reasoning behind the invasion in 2003. That's not my personal. It is personal to me because I was covering the State Department and foreign policy then, but I think that it's shared collectively by a lot of other reporters, with some very notable exceptions.
There's a general critique that one often hears that media broadly is on the more liberal side of the political spectrum. Is this a reasonable critique from your perspective? But more specifically, does one see this in foreign policy as much as one might see it in other areas of reporting?
I think that there are certain publications, certain news outlets that certainly are partisan and will adopt the stance of one particular administration or political party over that of another. I like to think of myself as being partisan only for the truth. I will give as much grief to Democrats as I do to Republicans, because I don't have a political affiliation. What I like to see is effective policy that is explained accurately. And so if regardless of who the president is from whatever political party, if I don't think that the policy is being explained, whether it's right or wrong is not really an issue, whether the policy is actually right or wrong. And I think that's where partisan, some kinds of partisan journalism that's where it is, because they come down and take a position on whether or not policy X is actually correct or not. I don't do that. I question policy X for whether it's working, and not for whose policy it is.
Matt Lee, in terms of digging for truth, you have no peer, so thank you very much for
Thank
joining
you.
us on Dakhel, Washington. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول حرية الصحافة في بلدكم، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.